All right. And while we're waiting for everyone else to finish connecting, I'm going to start sharing my screen so we can just quickly walk through our agenda and our introductions. Thank you for joining us today. I'm hoping to get us out maybe even a little early. Famous last words. We will see. All right. Thank you for joining us, everyone, on this lovely. See, Randy's still connecting. All right, Randy's connected. Hey, Randy. I'm going to get us moving so we can stay on track in case a couple others join us. But welcome, everyone. If you need orientation of time and place, this is the subgroup of the Connecticut Commission or Commission on Connecticut's Development Future. I'm never going to get that right. And this is the State Consolidated Housing Plan Working Group. This is our July meeting. And just to orient you a little bit, last time we met, we talked briefly about the state long-range housing plan. We reviewed our primary areas of focus. We talked about a couple of additions to that, and I promised to get you some basic draft recommendations, which I did, albeit yesterday. So I'm hoping that a few of you had a chance to at least look through those at a basic level. We will schedule some time later today to chat in our meeting to chat through that and talk about next steps and where we hope to be as we approach the fall time. So today we wanted to go through just our quick introductions and check-in just to talk about targeted scope of recommendations. This is an area we talked about a little bit at our last meeting. Remind ourselves of the specific charge and try to hone in a little bit on where we'd like to be responsive to that and set boundaries, and also identify some other statutes that may be at play or part of the conversation here that I want to review with you. 3 is to providing the initial feedback on the review of the draft recommendations. So I, as well as maybe some of you and others, can do some work in between this meeting and our next meeting. Finally, cover those next steps and homework, and then talk about our next meeting date, which is scheduled for September. So our meeting participation and norms, please use your camera within your comfort and ability. Please use your hand raise feature when possible so that I can sequence us as we're speaking. Move up your voice and listening as necessary. If you're someone who hasn't spoken, please do that. If you're someone who's spoken a lot, please try to make room for others as we have limited time. And then finally, respect our time. So I decided to go with a more fun check-in question rather than what you learned from reading the state long-range housing plan, which was last month's check-in question. So again, just as a reminder, we'll go over just the name and the hat you're wearing for this meeting, what organizational or personal role you're filling in this space, and then 2, for fun, your favorite summer food in a couple words so we can move through that quickly. We'll do it popcorn style, and I will turn off the screen sharing briefly so that you all can see all of one another a little easier. So I'll start. I'm Kylie Goslin. I'm the executive director of the Partnership for Strong Communities. We're a housing policy and advocacy group here in Connecticut. My favorite summer food is definitely lobster rolls. So that's me. And I tried to limit the number that I eat during the summer. It's a challenge. I'll call on Randy next. Randy, good to see you.
Hi, Randy Pincus. I'm a staff attorney with the Department of Housing. So here in that capacity, I would say that my favorite summer food is ice cream, except I don't really consider it only for the summer. That is my favorite all year food. So I guess I'd go with watermelon, but really it's ice cream.
Thanks, Randy. Pick anybody else to go next.
Oh, sorry, right. Anika.
Hi, Anika Singlemar, clinical professor of law. We're a future community and economic development clinic, as well as some other, a couple other courses. Kylie stole mine, so I'll just be more specific that my favorite summer food is the Connecticut style hot buttered lobster roll at Stowe's in West Haven, Connecticut. And I will call on Jim.
Wow. Well, so Kylie, Anika, and my 8-year-old daughter and I all love lobster rolls immensely. So I'll add myself to that list too. And I'm Jim Paris. I'm the CEO of the Home Builders and Remodelers Association of Connecticut. Let's see. I will go with William.
Hi, I'm Will Cromwell. I'm the clerk of the Housing Committee, and I help out on all these commission working group things. My favorite summer food is blueberry pie, and I'll call on Will Biederman.
Hi, Will. I run policy for the Housing Authority here in New Haven. My favorite summer food is a fried clam strip roll. And with that, I'll turn it over to Roger.
Roger, and with Connecticut Working Families. My favorite summer food, I'm team chocolate. So ice cream as well, especially chocolate ice cream. And I'll pass it to Kirk, I guess.
All right, thank you, Kirk Carr, citizen from Ridgefield, Connecticut. So just to be original, my favorite summer food is a hot dog on Main Street in Ridgefield at Shea, whatever his name is. Anyway, and next, I don't think Sam Gold, have you gone yet?
I have not because I joined late. I'm Sam Gold. I'm the executive director of RiverCog. And favorite summer food. Well, my favorite food, period, summer or otherwise, is pizza. And I live in New Haven, so pizza. But pizza
That's
outside
fair.
in the Sally's Pizza Tent.
Yeah,
It's
that's
outside.
really awesome. All right, who's next, Sam? I think we have Robert still to go. Marcia.
Go ahead, Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Porras. My favorite summer food is lobster roll. Sorry to not be original. I'm with the Groton Economic Development Commission. I'm vice chair.
Thanks, Robert. I think we have Marcia and Ashley left to go. So Marcia, why don't you jump in? You're on mute. Thanks.
Hi, Marcia. I'm with a local advocacy group called All In, and I've been interested in affordable housing for quite some time. So I've been learning. And my favorite summer food, I would have to say, is rotisserie chicken made at home. And Ashley.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley. I am the policy counsel for the majority leader. And my favorite summer food, I would probably have to say, is any kind of fruit salad, just because fruits make me think of summer.
Thanks, Ashley. And thank you, Ashley and Will, for your help in staffing this group, and Ashley for helping me get materials out. I really appreciate it. I do have a colleague here at the partnership who's going to be helping do some writing and supporting this work moving forward. She's out today. That's Kaylee Pratt. So you may see her on our meeting in September or receive emails or questions from her. So I just want to let you all know that. So with that, we'll get back to our conversation. And there's, again, 2 areas of focus I wanted to try to work us through today so we can get to a place where we can continue to refine recommendations moving forward. So I will share my screen again so that we can reorient ourselves, or maybe more so I can reorient myself. All right. Oops, back a little bit. All right, so we wanted to talk about our scope of recommendations in the process of starting to draft some of these recommendations, or put at least a little more flesh on the bones of the sort of 5 areas that you all helped identify. We started digging into statute a little more and identified a couple of places that really some statutes as well as some planning processes that kind of govern this space. And so I wanted to cover those because I think there's a sort of the question at hand maybe that we were discussing last time was whether the consolidated plan is the appropriate vehicle for broader housing planning. And I think as I've identified sort of more of these issues of planning, what I'm finding, I'll get to you in a second, Anika, too, is that there's multiple different housing planning processes, and they all cover different pieces that are sort of all happening at different stages, at different intervals throughout the state between different agencies as well. And so I wanted to just touch on a few of those and make you all aware of them as part of our conversation. I know some of you are in kind of different places with your understanding of housing policy, housing finance, housing funding streams, and all of that. So I wanted to take a moment to orient us to that and have a quick conversation about those. Before I do, I saw Anika had her hand up. So Anika, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was moved earlier today to do something I probably should have done a couple of months ago, which is just to search Westlaw for every reference in the Connecticut general statutes to the con plan. And it turns out that there are more than I had kind of remembered off the top of my head. So if you'd like, in the context of this, I'm happy to list those off after you've gone through the ones that you're talking about today.
Yep, that would be helpful. And I think it's also an area that I've identified that would be, as you noted, when I send out the my draft recommendations, there were some placeholders in there for further information. And I think adding a more robust conversation about the role of the consolidated plan and other elements. 8-37U was the one that Anika first brought to my attention. But as she noted, and I've done the same, there's several others. And I think it would be helpful for us to acknowledge those and potentially build them into our recommendations so that when we're providing these recommendations, whoever's reading them, and hopefully someone will, understands where the consolidated plan appears and that it has a role in housing planning a little bit, at least beyond the strict federal Code of Federal Regulations. So we've talked about the Code of Federal Regulations. I didn't include that in here. And you all know about 8-37T. That is the statute that simply requires Connecticut to do what it's required to do by the federal government, which is produce a plan every 5 years related to the 5 housing funding streams identified in the Code of Federal Regulations. And those are 5 federal only housing streams. So that doesn't include bonding, or it doesn't actually include all federal housing streams. It doesn't include LIHTC and a whole bunch of other things, as we've talked about here. So it's very narrow in its requirements as related to the Code of Federal Regulations requirement. As Anika noted, there are other places in statutes where references to the consolidated plan appear. So what's clear to me is that there are other points in time at which the consolidated plan was contemplated as a sort of a broader vehicle, even though at this moment in time, it's more strictly construed to those 5 funding streams. One of those is 8-37U. And that we don't have anyone from CHAFA on this working group, but that simply requires that CHAFA produce a annual plan that they submit to the Commissioner of Housing annually that talks about how they are going to, what their targets are for housing. And there's a whole bunch of other sort of broad requirements that are included in that for CHAFA. And I had a conversation with CHAFA about this also, which I can relay to you. And then the other thing is so we'll go into 8-37U in depth because I think it's a good sort of example of that. And we can talk more broadly about how to incorporate that. But at the moment, I just wanted to share this information with you. There's a couple other major sort of state planning processes, some of which have developed since some of these statutes were passed. And I think that's where this gets really confusing and messy, right? Is there are certain housing planning things like the qualified allocation plan, for example, which is the guiding document or the point system that the state is required to put together by the federal government for allocating low-income housing tax credits. That also used to be an annual process. It's now an every other year process. But that guides just the LIHTC funding, which is a large bucket of funding, but it's one program that really drives what ultimately ends up being 4 to sort of 7 projects per year annually. There is also a state strategic planning process for CHAFA, which includes other targets. That is a 3-year process. And as all of you know, there are other sort of state and local processes that occur. Most recently, the affordable housing plans at the municipal level, as well as we talked about the state long-range housing plan, which is no longer active, but was a planning process that was in place when the Department of Housing didn't exist and was part of DECD. So you'll see, as Anika notes, references to this, to the consolidated plan and other places. However, there's lots of other places where housing planning is happening. And I think what we've all shared, and then I'll turn over to Anika to raise a couple of those other places. I think what we've all identified in our last conversation is that it's good that all these different sort of that housing planning is happening. I think the concern is that there's not sort of an overarching document, or that by virtue of the fact that these different funding streams have different requirements and different guidelines that what we end up with is a very sort of scattered approach to housing policy that's driven more by individual funding streams or the desires, whims, whatever policy priorities of individual municipalities or different state agencies over time, rather than something that is really based on data and driving towards a broader policy solution to the state's affordable housing crisis. So I want to pause there. I see Sam has his hand up, and I'll take a few questions, and then I'll go to Anika to just share some more information about consolidated plan and statute. Sam?
Yeah, so I know I'm late in arriving to this committee, but I just wanted to raise maybe there should be under 3 other state planning processes. So the COGs aren't sort of a jack of all trades, and we get involved in all sorts of plans, state and regional plans that are not housing plans but touch upon housing. Whether it's and then we have the state plan of conservation and development, which was just approved, which identifies priority funding areas for the state. The DOT has transportation plans, which particularly when you're talking about transit-oriented development or accessible housing, transit is really important. And then there's DPH water planning about where the water and sewer infrastructure is. Yeah. And so even though those are not housing plans, they're inputs in decisions that probably should be referenced somewhere, to try to make this a more comprehensive housing plan and housing policy, where we're breaking down the silos of the different state agencies and moving away from a plan that just meets federal statute and meets the requirements of funding to actually a real vision of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I note too, and
vice versa. I think the state plan, these other agency plans, should refer to this plan.
Yes, and some of them are required to, as Anika may mention shortly. DECD is another area, right, where we have brownfields funding and other funding sources that often dovetail with whether it be affordable housing or just community development processes generally. And although this is specifically focused on affordable housing, right, CDBG, for example, can be used for multiple different types of things in addition to housing. And the 8-37U also references COGS and the role that COGS play in planning and the incorporation of COG plans into the Department of Housing. So we can go into that in a moment, but I want to let Anika jump in here for a moment too.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I did just send to everybody the full text of the various statutes that cite the consolidated plan. So the ones that we haven't talked about yet are the statute that governs allocation of private activity bonds for the purposes of multifamily construction by the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. The state's economic strategic plan, which was a statute that passed in 2014. And theoretically, there should have been a plan recently adopted pursuant to that statute, just based on the timelines in there. I can't say that I know whether that has happened. The duties of the Commissioner of Housing, that's probably self-explanatory. The Zoning Enabling Act requires that towns zone such that the zoning will meet the housing needs identified in the CON plan. The statute that governs evaluation of actions affecting the environment, so some of the things that Sam just referenced. And then obviously the POCD, the Plan of Conservation and Development, are the various things that in theory are supposed to consider the housing needs described in the CON plan.
Great. Any other questions on that? So I'll share with you all quickly, since we have it in front of us, a little bit of, so you can see what 8-37U looks like as sort of an example of that. So this, to Sam's point, requires the commissioner to work with regional councils of governments on housing planning and municipal agencies, housing authorities, other appropriate agencies for the purpose of coordinating housing policy and housing activities. And this isn't specific to the CON plan, but it's relevant because one of the conversations we were having last time was about interagency communication or other actors in the housing space, including PHAs, right, or municipalities and their role in this. So I wanted to point this out just to note that there is, under state law, a statute which requires the Commissioner of Housing to work with all of these groups, and ostensibly under the process that Mike Santoro outlined for the con plan, those groups do have an opportunity and in many cases are included in the planning process, but it may be something we want to reference in the recommendations. I would advise doing that to note and reinforce this as part of the annual or the sort of whatever the every 5-year process of putting this together. 8-37UB, now we're getting into annoying lawyer wonky space, but this is just talks more specifically about how the Commissioner of Housing has to coordinate those housing activities with other state agencies or quasi-state housing authorities. And again, reiterates what I was just discussing. And then finally is 8-37UC, and this is the element that requires CHAFA to produce this annual operating plan, and that plan should be submitted to the Commissioner of Housing. And it is relatively specific, although they're broad recommendations, but specific on what it should include, including production targets under each multifamily program of the authority, which includes different funding sources than are simply required in the con plan. But it has to be consistent with the consolidated plan. Obviously, this looks like it was first put together at some point back in 1980-ish. So I talked with our friends at CHAFA just to get a sense of what's happening with this particular space, for example, since we talked about CHAFA's involvement in the housing planning process. And I'm also a board member of CHAFA, so this was interesting for me to learn. They haven't produced this plan specifically in several years. There's several reasons for that. One, they do other planning KPI and metrics that are included in multiple other documents that they produce, including their state and including their strategic plan. But this was written prior to there being maybe there was a Department of Housing at that point, and then it went into DECD and came out. But this was also written prior to the current state of being with CHAFA right now, which is that the Commissioner of Housing sits as the chairperson of the board of CHAFA. So there already is a good amount of coordination between these two agencies. But for those of you who work in the space, sometimes that coordination has varied depending on who's at the helm of those organizations, which is, I think, true, you could say, of any of the actors in this space. But I shared this with you just so that you have an understanding, again, that there's multiple requirements for planning in state law. There's also multiple other planning processes happening. Some of them are required but not happening. Others are happening in different pieces and places. But it's what struck me, and I think, just noting, for example, the places that Anika just outlined, is that there's a lot of arrows pointing to the consolidated plan as sort of the potential place where that coordination either should happen or where other existing plans should be woven in or aligned with, I should say, the consolidated plan's policy goals. So to me, I think, but I'm curious to hear from all of you, is to going back to the conversation we had last time about whether the consolidated plan should sort of continue to serve that role of being sort of the central point. And if so, that we kind of redirect to the state and emphasize the places where there needs to be better coordination with the consolidated plan, as is already required. Or if you all feel that there should be an alternate document that takes the place of the consolidated plan, or otherwise helps direct housing policy from more of a 30,000-foot view. Or if you have any other thoughts or questions about any of the information I've just shared. Okay, you can all be quiet. That's totally fine. I'm going to assume by your silence in the existing statute that we would like to continue to point towards the consolidated plan as that space, which I'm fine with doing. I think it will require us doing a little more statutory digging to make sure we're including a lot of these references and really specifically reminding the state about the goal of the consolidated plan beyond its federal requirements. Does anybody have any challenges with that? So again, continuing to focus on the consolidated plan, but acknowledging that other state statutes identify this as a place for with which to be aligned with housing policy. Anika?
Yeah, I can't say, I feel like I said this last time and I haven't made any progress. Like, I'm not sure what the right answer here is.
Yeah.
It strikes me that it's unlikely that DOH will ever treat the consolidated plan as a document that is broader than what's required in the CFR. And that's not a criticism. I think it's just a reality. Like, they have this thing that the federal government says they're supposed to do, and then they do it. Why would they add anything else to it? But then you have all these other state statutes that almost assume that the consolidated plan is something that it's not. Yeah. And they're looking to it for guidance that it really doesn't provide, and it's not going to provide. And I can't see, I don't know what to do about that, particularly in an environment where we know already that there are like various planning and documentary requirements that agencies routinely ignore, not necessarily, again, because they're bad people in those agencies, but there's not sufficient capacity. Our administrative state is completely understaffed. We don't have a statewide planning agency. Like, we just have not built the infrastructure necessary to do some of these things.
Yep.
We don't take them at all seriously as a matter of kind of public will. So I'm not sure. I just don't know that I've settled on it. I don't know that silence is, my silence anyway, ought to be interpreted as something
in that direction.
I don't know that I know yet. Yeah.
Moving in the direction of trying effectively beefing that up as that tool. But I see Randy has her hand up, and so maybe Randy, you can shed some light on this too. You're on mute.
I'm so used to Teams that I just Zoom. I couldn't find the hand raising thing. So I apologize. I'm not sure I can shed light. I do want to thank Anika for acknowledging the understaffing issue, which I'm sure will come up in my comments throughout this process, only because yeah, there's like 40 of us total. So but that's a separate issue. I just did want to mention that I had forwarded the draft that you sent yesterday to Michael to take a look at as well, because as you know, he's the one, he and his team are the ones that are really in the weeds with this process. So I know there are requirements that they're very familiar with, and they would have a broader sense of this, but I hadn't seen it before yesterday, so I have not gotten his thoughts back, but there may be more that he has to share on that.
Yep.
And part of the Anika, I think what I gather from everything that I've learned from Michael is the, unwillingness to treat it as anything more, is that the federal, you just have to keep in mind that in addition to the state requirements, there are federal requirements, and they have to use the vehicle, right? There's a portal that they use, and there's pretty much, as far as I understand, there's very little flexibility as to how to input the information and the format and for the federal piece of it. So there may be limitations in that regard, which, maybe substantive, may in fact be procedural, that make it very challenging to do that. So, I don't think anything is or should be perceived as an unwillingness to go beyond, certain strictures, but there's just realities of how, these things are set up and structured, not just in the state law, which is, of course, what we have some role in here. But, I haven't figured out our, power on the federal government yet.
Right.
I think we'll probably need to write up half a page about that, Randy. So it would be helpful to get some certainty about that.
Well, and I'm going to, that's why I sent it to Michael yesterday, but I'm sure it was a lengthy document towards the end of the day, and we haven't had a chance to
I don't even necessarily mean, I just mean specifically, we're going to have to add a section to our document that says it is almost impossible to add stuff to the con plan because the federal portal for inputting the information does not permit this other stuff that we might otherwise want to see.
Yeah, and that would be just technical information that I could know, find out from Michael and his staff, which
Exactly.
is
Thank you.
fine. Absolutely. You know, and I do think all of this, obviously, you know, I don't know the scope of what our recommendations can be, but I'll just put out there as a blanket statement for our work that, you know, it's hard to add a lot to what has to be done without also adding some funding. I mean, that
Yes.
not to be crass, but you know, there's one
No.
person who works with Michael on these reports and she only has so many hours in the day.
Yeah, no, I was going to say too, there's also nothing that prohibits us from advising in our recommendations that there be in order to effectuate a plan that goes beyond the requirements of the con plan and sort of meets the true identity that the document has assumed directly or indirectly by development of other state statutes, that there needs to be an additional or 2 full-time staff positions housed at either CHAFA or DOH, which are dedicated to executing the planning and pulling together these different plans and identifying where they're misaligned or aligned and doing the work of trying to really coordinate this. That may be something that we want to recommend. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. And I think in the greater scheme of the cost of things, that having 2 positions whose job it was to do that, you know, we're talking a couple $100,000 in the greater scheme of the state budget. If it creates some consistency around state housing funding and also creates more capacity at DOH to do the kind of work we're talking about, Randy, I would be totally in support of that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the legislature is going to take it up, right? What I agree, having government myself, we don't want to do is, you know, triple the amount of work, including a needs assessment every other year, for example, which we currently have, without providing additional resources to do that, because
And
it just ourselves up for failure if we don't prioritize it with humans, right?
Right. And frankly, you know, then you take resources away from actually creating the housing and, you know, all the actual, I don't want to call this not substantive work, but, you know, the underlying work that achieves the goals, hopefully, that are set forth.
Okay. So we can work at potentially, as Anika noted, I like the idea of adding a section that references at least some of the limitations that the either the portal or the process that's set forth in the Code of Federal Regulations currently sets, and that any recommendations we create that go beyond that, we recognize would require an additional form or format that exists sort of outside of that portal, and or may require additional positions. And if folks have any, I'm just trying to sort of reflect back what I'm hearing in the conversation. If you have any thoughts that are different from that, raise your hand and let me know. Or you can also email myself and I will, if you'd rather do that, if you have concerns or questions, and I will do my best to respond and incorporate as I can. Checking to see if I'm missing anybody else here. Okay. All right. Any other questions about either 8-37U or other statutory references to the consolidated plan, or sort of the rubric and structure of that currently in state statute? I know we've spent a good amount of each of these meetings doing some new learning, and I'm totally fine in the case as we continue to develop these. So if you come across other references or information or processes which you think would be helpful to include in the draft recommendations, or that you think would be helpful for this group to have conversation about, please by all means email me. I'm kind of a one-woman show, but I will do my best. Or if you have a particular area that you'd like to highlight or propose, we're happy to work through that. All right, I will move along to the draft recommendations. I recognize they ended up being a little more lengthy than I anticipated, but it was my goal just to really get something down on paper for us to start chewing on. So I want to emphasize before I get started, there's plenty of room for additional commentary, additional feedback, additional data and information. I expect this to be a more robust list of recommendations than what I put forward. So my goal is to put forward at least like a framework that included some placeholders and provided you all an opportunity to reflect on whether you feel like things are headed in the right direction, or if there's areas that you would like to assist with. So with that, I'll remind us of our sort of areas of focus. The area in red we added, and as part of our conversation last time, we all talked about housing quality as part of a major area of focus. Where that currently fits into the existing requirements for the consolidated plan as it exists under the CFR and the funding streams that it's required to respond to, is a little bit different. There's certain funding streams which can be used for rehabilitation, preservation, or things like improving existing housing. And there's others that can't, or which can only be applied to housing that is deed restricted or income restricted, for example. That being said, rather than subsuming it under the rehabilitation and preservation focus, because of the conversation we had last time, I added it as a separate category, as I thought it warranted, if we were going to go in the direction of trying to create a little bit of a broader role for the consolidated plan, and that it may include other funding streams, that it's an important enough area to address. For those of you who don't know, we have one of the oldest housing stocks in the country, which shouldn't come as a surprise. But by way of background and information, much of our multifamily housing stock, that which some people refer to as NOAA, or naturally occurring affordable housing, that is just rental housing primarily that exists in our urban centers, is oftentimes in poor quality, and that results in negative health income or health outcomes. It disproportionately affects BIPOC communities, as many of you all know. So I decided to make it its own category, but I'm willing to take thoughts and suggestions on that. But that's why that's highlighted in red, by way of a long-winded explanation. So these were the major areas, again, that you all noted in our original review. And I wanted to just reflect on these quickly to determine whether, in reading these sort of initial draft recommendations, there's anything else that stuck out to you as being missing in the conversation or in the recommendations. Did these still feel like broadly the right categories under which to create our actions? Okay. Seeing nodding, so I'll take that as a yes. All right. With that, and sorry, I didn't mean to move ahead. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm just going to pull up the recommendations. I'm going to offer you all any opportunity you want to throw any spaghetti at the wall or offer any edits or suggestions now, noting that when I move to our sort of next steps conversation, we'll talk about a broader period of sort of redlining and response via email. But I wanted to at least offer the opportunity, since we sent this out yesterday, to have some more conversation about it. And I may make some edits right in the document as we're doing this. Move you off to my side. You will see just my Word version that I have up here. Okay. So open conversation beyond the sort of additional, or the informational, which we talked about augmenting a little bit today, as well as a problem statement, which I'd like to insert that talks at least about the current state of affordable housing and housing insecurity. So we have some framing. What, if anything, do folks have in terms of questions, thoughts, recommendations, or changes that they might like to see based on initial review of the draft recommendations themselves? Again, they can be broader, they can be more finite. If you want to get into typos, of which I'm sure there are many, feel free. Bruce, welcome. Go ahead, and then I see Marcia's hand up too.
Okay, thank you. Just so you know why I'm here or who I am, I'm from OPM, and my program lost 2 people in the last 2 weeks, one to retirement, one to another agency. So we are scrambling to fill the various subcommittees. And so I had intended just to listen, but I wanted to ask, has there been any conversation about including associated things like the relationship between housing and transportation, so that somebody, so that there would be encouragement to put housing where people have improved chances of not having to, have a car for every single adult in the family? Is that a relevant thing for this work group, or does that belong somewhere else?
I will note that I believe the existing consolidated plan, Bruce, does talk about TOD somewhat, and it is conversation that this group had. We included it under the tailoring plan to communities component briefly, but it certainly would warrant further a more detailed recommendation around more intentional planning guidance as it relates to TOD related housing. You see here related to environmental concerns. We had including decreasing vehicle mass traveled, facilitating potential to provide necessary infrastructure and transportation, but we could certainly include more focus on TOD in that bucket.
Okay, that would be great because, you know, it works both ways. I don't like the term TOD. I try to avoid it at all costs now, but you know, the notion not just of let's build stuff near where transit is, but to the extent possible, encouraging transit to go where, whether it's naturally occurring affordable housing or just where affordable housing is more viable or desirable for other reasons. It seems reasonable to have that part of this plan.
Okay.
Thanks.
And I don't want to scare any of you off from offering comments, but if you make a suggestion like Bruce just did, I may call on you and ask you to provide some language.
Oh my.
Thanks. I see Marcia has her hand up. Marcia, go ahead, and then Will.
So as I was doing lots of reading here, I thought that it was when people are being talked to for all of these plans, it seems like they're asking people who have who work for an agency or talk to people who are struggling with housing rather than having any focus groups that deal with people who are actually having problems and looking for ideas. Is it possible to add those kinds of groups when plans are being made?
Yes. In fact, that was a question I had in going through this recently was, were there any real recommendations we wanted to make to the process? And Mike Santoro detailed that a little bit, the process that the Department of Housing goes through in producing this, the sort of public input process that currently exists. And there are specific groups, but including people with lived expertise of housing and security as part of that could certainly be a recommendation that we make. Is that what you're suggesting, Marcia? Am I understanding you?
I'm suggesting not only people who deal with people who are, let's say, homeless or living in poor or living in poor quarters, that those people be included in the conversation, what their viewpoint is.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. All right. I am going to just make a note of that here. Excuse my typos as I move quickly through this. I see Will and then Kirk.
Thanks, Kylie. A couple things. To Bruce's point, and this is slightly orthogonal, but maybe related if we're talking about sort of the some similar ultimate outcomes. On the housing quality and I think particularly around health, I wonder if there's a value in adding questions about VMT or just pollutants broadly into that section. It's not quite the rehabilitation, but it's a corollary, correlation. Also in subsection 2, that's sort of correlated to the opportunity map, but maybe not explicitly tied. Yeah. I wonder if we want to add proximity to jobs or questions of opportunity for economic growth.
Yeah, I know. I don't believe that the pollutants and sort of environmental air quality is included in the current mapping. I know that employment, access to jobs wasn't included in the opportunity mapping, but
Okay.
I will note that here though, and I will make sure that I go back and double check it. And it may also be relevant to include as a standalone comment anyway.
I get right. Maybe under subsection 3.2 or 0.3, whether we want to consider lead specifically or name lead specifically. I know the governor that we just passed some sort of change, I think, but I don't know what that looks like in detail. And I have a couple questions or thoughts about the housing needs assessment, which is specifically, and this is maybe a little too specific, but the language that we should set, the comp plan should set clear, realistic, measurable targets. I wonder if realistic limits the scope of options too much, and whether we should be encouraging the plan to say what's needed and let everyone else figure out quite how realistic they want to be.
Yes, it's something that crossed my mind as well. I'm curious to hear if others have thoughts on that too.
And the last thing for me I have is just, do we want to be specific about the geography of the needs assessment? And do we want, like, is that statewide? Do we want to make that by county, by COG, or something smaller? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about that comment. So what you're saying is, should the needs assessment be broken down to create targets that are more regional or sort of focused than broader state housing targets? Is that what you're recommending, Will? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a best case scenario, that's what something like the municipal affordable housing plans could have done or could do. We haven't really seen that, but it seems like there could be some real value in putting numbers that are not specific to COGs or counties because of the differences within those places.
Yeah. All right, I may reach out to you more on that too. Just noting where folks made comments so I can circle back with you if we need more. And there's 2 Wills. Got it. Thank you. Kirk, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
To me, I think one of the most important parts of this plan is tailoring to the community. And I think when you do the needs assessment, it probably should get to the community level. And some of the things that are in here, like local fiscal capacity, I'm not really sure what you mean by that in this context. But I mean, clearly we have a lot of data on towns in Connecticut in terms of the percentage of people that are in poverty, the percentage of assisted housing units or income restricted units. And we can quickly do some ratios about how many people in poverty there are for every unit. And I've done that, that ratio, and they go from a half a person per unit to 46 people per unit. So there's some places where you have, and very often you find it's a low poverty number, and it's just that it's a low unit number. Like there's one unit in this one town, and they have 46 people that are below the poverty rate. So it's 46 people for one unit. Now, does that cause? I mean, are they cost burdened? I mean, what does that do to cost burden, for example? But we have all that data by town. I mean, it's not something we have to go out and create. I think the other one is the historic success or failures. I think one of the problems is that a lot of things that have been done without setting objectives. So when you start to try to determine whether you succeeded or failed without an objective, it's sometimes rather hard to do. I mean, 830G has been on the books for 33 years. I'm not exactly sure. It'd be interesting to go back and see what was said about the objective and to be able to come back and say, well, have we as a state achieved that objective, moved toward that objective? And I think the answer would probably be, a 10% number across all communities that have poverty rates of 1% to 38% does not really tailor the solution to the need, which is different in every community. And so I think this tailoring to the communities is something we ought to, think about, and we have data that can help us do that.
Yeah, I think so I put in a note there about maybe objective setting for municipalities, and I think based on your comment, right, opinions would vary on whether folks feel that communities that don't currently house many folks who are, as you say, under the poverty line or lower income, should be doing more of that versus assuming that it makes sense to continue keeping most of our low-income folks relegated to certain municipalities simply because that's where housing is. So I just made a note here to perhaps consider objective setting for municipalities. And I think to your point, there's different ways that you could calculate that. I see Anika and then Will.
Yeah, just really quickly, Connecticut law today requires every town to facilitate the meeting of housing need by region, not just the need in that individual town. That's frankly, there's language to that effect in Euclid v. City of Ampler, which is the U.S. Supreme Court decision that.
Right, I was going to say federal law also.
Yeah. And it seems rather circular reasoning to me to say that we ought to that where poor people exist today in a town with in a state with very constrained affordable housing is where they ought to live forever, in a country that prides itself on mobility as a pathway to the American dream. But I also just want to say that I do not intend to retort to any more of what Kirk says for the rest of this for the sake of my own sanity, unless somebody else says, I agree with Kirk, in which case I will. But from henceforth, just assume that I disagree with him vehemently, but I will not waste your time explaining why I disagree with him unless one of you thinks that what he just said was super compelling.
Noting we're making room for all opinions, but understood and noted. Mika, thank you. It's my job to hear everyone out, so that's what I'm doing here. Will.
I think sort of to that point, and maybe this is implied with the consideration of racial and economic segregation and the opportunity map. Is there any value in putting anything specifically, it could be in the needs assessment or in the tailoring plans to communities, that encourages or mobility or builds for mobility, trying to create like additional options? I don't know if this is sort of already covered, but it does feel like a lot of this plan, a lot of our other plans are very focused on, I mean, reasonably the needs without maybe the desires or the excess opportunity we could create through policy.
Yeah, and I'd note too that even within the funding streams right now that the consolidated plan is designed to address, there are resources there, for example, that can be used for home ownership as well as rental. And yeah, I think to your point, well, certainly some of the mobility component is reflected in the comment about the opportunity mapping, but a more robust conversation about that, or the potential, again, if we're saying, hey, this consolidated plan should be more well-resourced in its development at DOH, and also perhaps address some of the other funding streams, or at least incorporate plans for other funding streams, then a conversation about mobility and even perhaps some of the homeownership components, which certainly fall within CHFA's purview and DOH would be relevant here. I know that's something several of you have raised in comments to me, is about whether this should do some more homeownership conversation. And as I noted, there are resources within this that do that, that do allow for that. Roger?
I was muted. Two quick comments. One, following on what Will was saying, agreeing with how opportunity is not evenly distributed in the state. It is important, though, that we take into account that a solution for opportunity for low-income families in Connecticut should not be moving them close to white people, so to say. The proximity to whiteness is a solution. It's a recipe for actually hollowing out even more the areas that are already depressed. We don't want to fix Bridgeport by having people from Bridgeport leave Bridgeport. We want to fix Bridgeport by having Bridgeport being a prosperous community and building and creating opportunity where people are, not just forcing them to move to another neighborhood or another town or another city. The other comment not directly related to this is on section 6. We, knowing that this is a plan that it's focused on federal funding and using federal funds, it's also important, I think, to stress and develop more the idea that a lot of the solutions for low-income housing in Connecticut do not cost money and do not necessarily need public funding. They need reforms that are market-driven. So opening more land, upzoning, allowing more density. It may not be creating directly market rate housing, but it might push housing prices for other properties that are already in town lower and making them affordable. So including as part of the strategy, what market-based, essentially solutions that do not require direct intervention, but just changes in regulation, changes in zoning, changes on how we allow building or where we allow building, what kinds of buildings we are allowing close to city centers, train stations, and so on and so forth. It's important.
Okay. I may reach out to you some more on that. Roger, just to make sure Okay. Anything else folks want to know? Again, you're more than welcome to send me as detailed commentary or additional information you feel, or a red line. If you do send textual change recommendations, it would be preferable if you can put them in a red line. They're just clear and easier to read that way. Certainly whatever works for you will make work. All right. Any other thoughts on this before I talk a little bit about next steps? Okay. All righty, let's stop sharing. So with that, now again, okay. Now it doesn't. Sorry. Give me a second. All right. So where are we? We are here. Next steps and homework. So I am going to ask that if you have recommendations in addition to what we talked about today, or perhaps you didn't have time to review things since yesterday when this was circulated, which is fine, that you send me any suggested edits. If you have questions about certain areas and you want more information, please feel free also to send those along. I'm going to ask you get them back to me by Friday, August 12th, which gives you a month to do that. I know there's a lot of vacations coming up and that sort of thing, and people are taking time off. So I'm hoping by giving everybody a full month on sort of this round, that will ensure that everybody has an opportunity to provide some input. It will be then my goal between the middle of August and our next meeting, which is scheduled till September, to turn around to you an updated draft that incorporates as much of what we talked about today as we can, and that also incorporates any additional edits that you've sent to me by mid-August. I may call on some of you to assist with either reviewing or providing more input on certain sections. I know that I may use some partnership staff here to do that also. So I expect that by mid-September, I will send you a more robust draft. And then from that point, it's my hope that we can work to refine that and finalize it over the fall. I'm going to say over the fall is like my optimistic way, saying that it's my goal to wrap it up by December, but hopefully we can do that even sooner, perhaps by October, if we feel like we're all heading in the right direction and we're comfortable with where we're at. Any questions on that plan?
I just have a silly question, Kylie, and I apologize. I imagine this question could have already been asked, but do we have, obviously every state in the union has to submit, a consolidated housing plan. Do we have gold standards out there that we can kind of look at and emulate, or at least contemplate emulating?
Yes.
Or stealing,
So I made a note in the draft that went around. There's a place in there where I made a recommendation for inserting some potential best practices as it relates to comp plans. And so if you have information about that, or you want to be the person to volunteer to do that review, let me know. But I do think that is warranted, and we may be able to do a little bit of that here at the partnership. Maybe Anika has a student interested in digging into that a little bit, or others if you have access to staff or have the time yourself to look at that. But yes, I did put in a placeholder, Jim, in that first section where we talk about what the consolidated plan is in Connecticut, to perhaps highlight some other states and what they I think we had talked about California, and there's a couple other places that may have some more robust processes in place, noting they may also have additional resources that we don't have. But
I hate pointing to California, where some of the highest housing costs in the country.
It has a great housing market in California, right? If you're
that's true, but what happens is that in the last couple of years, there's more response to that, right? So they haven't fixed it, but they are at least trying to think about it.
Yeah.
And there are some places where it's just not a live issue because they didn't zone themselves into this problem.
Right. There may also be some other states that have other sort of housing policy planning vehicles outside of the con plan. And so that's going to be another place that I'm going to be taking a look at too. Not necessarily for us to decide, hey, we should create an engine that looks just like that, but maybe there's elements of that we want to propose incorporating in this. And again, also really looking at resources. Do states have dedicated departments doing this work? And if so, and there's some great best practice there, but they have a team within a state department or a separate state planning department doing that. And then I think it warrants us raising that in our recommendations, either noting that it's something Connecticut should consider doing if they want to do this, or identifying places where simply at least inserting a few staff positions in existing departments would be helpful.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, I think the comparative work here is necessary, and it is complicated because it's hard to address causation, right? Like the reason Texas has lower housing costs than us is not because they do a better job at the state level, but it's because their local governments don't mess it up so badly, right? The minimum 2-acre lots are just like people would laugh at you. So we wouldn't want to emulate necessarily what they do at the state level, but simultaneously, it doesn't mean that I don't know. It's hard to really parse. It's hard to really parse some of the causations here because you've got like multiple levels of government pulling various different levers. But I do think that some kind of comparative work here is important.
Agree. Any other thoughts or questions in this space? See their hands up. All right. So our next meeting is Thursday, September 15th. I intentionally didn't schedule a meeting in August just because attendance tends to be abysmal, but I feel like we're actually at a great place to have a 2-month break where we are, and it gives us some time to really try to do some work in addressing some of the comments that you set forth and give us, those of us who might be digging into this a little more, some more time to do, for example, some of the best practice work that we were just talking about. Again, if you have other thoughts or ideas about that, please feel free to reach out. I want to make sure that this isn't my personal draft, but that it's something you all feel a sense of ownership over when present it to the commission as a whole. We will also let you know about October meetings. I believe, and Ashley can, if I'm not mistaken, that our prior doodle poll only went through September. And if that's the case, we may need to do an additional one, but I want to make sure we do that so that we get a couple meetings on the calendar for us to hold in towards the end of the fall in case we need them. So I will coordinate with Ashley and Will on that as necessary. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, with that, I'll give you 20 minutes of your life back to do whatever it is that you would like to use that time for. Maybe go eat a lobster roll, apparently. You seem to enjoy, or blueberry pie, or both, because they go together fabulously, as does the pizza situation. So anyway, I appreciate your time today. Continue, please, to send me information and thoughts and ideas, and I will do my best to try to patch things together. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your summer, and I will see you all in September. Thanks, everyone.